Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So many of you have been pestering me to test out the new Dark Maidens gear, whether it actually works how it says it does. It's got some unique bonuses that we haven't seen before, like 15% threat generation, 10% divinity soul weave, performance regeneration, and then a foot piece that gives bonuses depending on what role you are. So let's get that all tested out and I'll show you my results. But before we do so, make sure to claim your free gift of 25 Scrolls of Mass Life. They're pretty useful. They'll get you through content by being able to resurrect yourself if you go down. Generally, reserve scrolls for content that's more on the challenging side. For example, your Master Temple of the Spider or Master Demogorgon, where you can't really rely on allies to pick you up when things are going tough, and let's say there's groups of ads and they'll just kill the person who's trying to pick you up. And so scrolls can be pretty useful, but keep in mind you can only have 5 deaths in any fight, and at the 5th death you're permadead and you're back to the campfire, reset for you. And each time you do receive a death and scroll, you'll get a skull, and you'll basically receive 10% damage reduction and 10% hit points. And so you want to make sure you're using the Revive Sickness boon, which will reduce that by a half. So only 5% less damage and 5% less hit points. Good thing to know is those skulls do not affect your healing. So healers are getting away with that. So now let's move to the Dark Maidens gear. You can see, for example, the full set right here, and it would have you looking something like this. It's definitely a particular taste. But let's start out with, let's say you want to run this gear as a DPS character. Well, the headpiece will give you 1% action points every time you get a kill. And these are very much like the primal boots and features you might have like on the wizard with combustive action. And you could stack all that if you were a wizard, and that'd be pretty cool. And with my recent wizard build, you can very viably run this helmet just for AoE. But otherwise, it's only 1% versus the primal ones having 3%. So personally, I don't really think it's worth it. But does it work? It does indeed, but it has like a 1-second cooldown per like trigger. So if you kill like 10 enemies within 1 hit, you'll unfortunately only gain 1% extra action points. Yeah, it's a bit of a bummer, but that's how it is, and that's pretty much, I believe, how all of those bonuses work. Then you go to the armor piece here, and you could see it says it gives you Maiden's Blade, giving you that 5% damage against enemies who are not facing you. And this does actually work. You can test it on your dummy, you can compare your damage, and you can see it right here. Dark Maiden's armor was actually working. And you can test it then within Underdark, and it does indeed give that 10%. So very good to see that. Just you're going to have to play positioning right and make sure you're behind the enemy. For example, this dummy, you'll have to be like 30 degrees left or right behind it in order to gain the damage bonus. Again, doubled in Underdark, but it is only a damage buff, not like a multiplicative damage, so I don't see it as good as, let's say, generally running stats. But it can be reliable if you're running Underdark content, so that's like a 10% all the time. You don't have to worry about stacks from like Ribcage, Serene Robe, so on, those kind of armor pieces which either take time to proc off and you're going to have to do certain damage over a certain amount depending on your hit points, etc. So next up we have the arms, and they give us critical force, basically a 10% chance when you critically strike to deal 150 magnitude damage around you. So it's like an area effect. You'll see that when you're attacking the dummy here. You see the dummy to our left just there, but there we finally got it to trigger on this guy right here. However, that damage is not really a true 150 magnitude. If it was, maybe it would be slightly better, but as it stands with a 15-second cooldown, it's garbage. You can see its damage right here, 150 magnitude damage around you, but that 150 magnitude is not affected by your stats or any of your damage buffs. You can see that right here. This would be the base. It should deal like 11,000, nearly 12,000 damage if it was affected by my stats, but it is not. It cannot crit, and yeah, so it's just 150 magnitude multiplied by the enemy's defense, and then you get that 6,000, which is exactly equal to your base damage, the number you see just here. Very disappointing arms piece. If it had a 5-second cooldown, it could be used to proc like the Grace Ring or Vistani, since it's an AoE effect, and it does seem to trigger on, let's say, these dummies. So next up, we have the boots, and they're unique in that they're only going to be good within Temple of the Spider. You can run them in Underdark, but I don't really see it worth it. You're better off running other boots. That'll give you a lot more power. But you can see it essentially would give you the bonus power when in Underdark, and then depending on your roll, it'll give you a 5% boost to whether that's your outgoing damage, reducing your incoming damage, or increasing your outgoing healing, all by 5%. And on DPS, it's very good to see that it does indeed work to give you the 5% extra damage. However, again, it's just a damage buff, so it will be diminished the more you have. Now, as I mentioned, these bonuses change depending on your role. If we're a healer, you can see the helmet changes to give 10% divinity or performance or soul weave regeneration. The cleric healer and the paladin healer have divinity, and the bard has performance, and the warlock has soul weave. All pretty much the same resource you're going to use for your healing spells, like our divine shelter or our divine touch on the paladin. And so this helmet would essentially allow us to cast more heals, right? If it worked. Well, we can test that, and you can see here are my results. Again, testing on the paladin, it shouldn't be any different for the others, but it does indeed provide an additive divinity regeneration buff of 10%. That's additive, meaning it will diminish depending on how many other buffs you have of divinity regeneration. We tested our base divinity regen. Just empty your divinity and basically watch that divinity bar tick up, and then you have a look and you can see you get 38 divinity regen per tick. That's once every 3 seconds. And when we use the Dark Maiden's head, that gets increased to 41.8 divinity regen per tick. And so that's correct, a 10% base divinity regen increase. Now, if we're to stack that with something else, let's say Composure on the Paladin, which also gives 10% additional divinity regen, well, it's additive, because you can see that yes, you get up to 41.8 seconds with Composure, and then if you use both Composure and the Dark Maiden's head, you go to 45.6. Again, that's divinity regen per tick once every 3 seconds. And so this would be the math then. You add the 10% to the 10%, and that's 20%. So then our 38 times 1.2, which is 120%, you get the 45.6 as we are seeing. And so that's a correct additive divinity buff. If it was multiplicative, then it would be 38 times 10% times 10%, and that would be 45.98, which it is not. So it's an additive divinity regen buff, not multiplicative, which just means the more divinity regen sources you have, basically the less effective they are. Ultimately, would I use that helmet on a healer? I would if you don't need any more stats. I wouldn't prioritize it over like power or outgoing healing. Those are your main healing stats. Then you do have critical strike and critical severity, but the effectiveness from them is reduced by half, but still it's going to be a flat increase to your healing, and that's kind of what you want to prioritize before lastly going to the increased regenerating that pool of your healing. Then again, on the healer, we also have the boots, which would give us the 5% additional healing. And well, you can have a look. You can go in Temple of Spider and so on, and it doesn't seem to increase your outgoing healing. If you're below the cap, if you're like 60% and you put these boots on and you go in Temple of the Spider, you will not see an increase to your stat. So people have said it's not working, right? Because it says it gives 5% outgoing healing. Well, it actually does work. We can have a look at our test results here. We're indeed getting the power, but with that outgoing healing, it does add to your outgoing healing stat. It just does not show on the character sheet. And you can look at my math there of the values I was getting. And let's say you were to add that 5% to your healing buffs. So those healing buffs would be like from Masterwork, which say they give you outgoing healing. Now, you will not see the increase to your character sheet, but you will receive that additional healing. These boots could work just like that, but they don't. You can see just down here that the Dark Maiden's feet, our base when we don't use them is a healing for 46,464, and when we do use them, we're seeing 47,860. And that is when we just increase our outgoing healing stat from like 66% to 71%. And we don't actually see that increase on our character sheet. But if it was, let's say, heal buff and added to like Masterwork, you would see this going up to 7% from 2%, additional 5%. And we should see like 48,700, but we do not see that. So it is giving a bit less than the 5%, than the true 5%, because it's adding to our existing stat already, but it's hidden. It doesn't show on the character sheet. So I wanted to question, does it go over the cap? So I increased my outgoing healing to 90%, slotted the boots, and went to check if we'd see any heal increase. And well, we can look at the math on that then as well. And we actually were seeing a heal increase. Like the base right here with 90% outgoing healing, if it was not to go over the cap, we would see that 48,000, which we're actually seeing higher than that, up to 49,900, which is what we see when we get our outgoing healing above the cap to 95%. And so those boots work, and they seem to go and increase your outgoing healing stat over the cap. So they will work, and I do recommend them as a healer then. At least if you do not need like the ratings you'll get from, let's say, the Dragonhide boots here, you could get like 10,000 outgoing healing. And then there is the gear that you could use for the tank. You have the headpiece, which has the 15% threat generation. You have the boots with the role of a tank, reducing the incoming damage you take. Have I tested these? Well, I've tried with the helmet, and very frustratingly, we were getting all sorts of different values for our modifier. I don't know whether that was just because I wasn't having a long enough damage test. You can see, for example, we look at my damage on the dummy and we look at somebody else's, Psy, who very thankfully helped me with that. And you basically divide the damage and see the difference between what's the multiplier. And so we'd use it without the helmet, and then we'd slot the helmet and see if there's any increase. And we were getting values then up to like 7.1, 8.2, and then going without the helmet, 6.6. The values are just all over the place, and I think I need to test myself, get like my second account and go and attack those dummies. Basically what you do is you reset the dummies, you die, and then one person attacks the dummy for a certain amount of time, and then the other person goes and attacks the dummy until they receive aggro by looking at your bubble just here, your threat meter. And then you want to make it so that you're just about equal, and then you can equate the damage that both of you have dealt and get that modifier. You need to keep in mind of the different modifiers on the tanks, and like a while back I tested the tank threat modifiers, and you can check that video out for the paladin. It can help to see what powers are better than others to prioritize with regards to trying to hold the aggro of your enemies. Ultimately, yeah, I did not test the boots then as well because it's really hard. There's no dummy which is going to hit you always the same amount of damage. And then you'd have to have one in the Temple of the Spider. Yes, I can do it, but it's a lot of work. Ultimately, I'm not going to use these boots on my tank because they're just not as good as like the Wisps of the Shadow Demon or the newer rugged boots with that bonus of increasing your hit points by a whole freaking 20%. Enemies will critically hit you half the time, and healers will critically heal you 90% of the time. And those both effects can trigger this fairly easily, and most of the fight you will have this effect up. And so it's really beneficial for survivability having a freaking 20% increase to your hit points as a freaking tank. Otherwise, there's like the Boots of the Herald where you'll increase everybody's defense, and I would recommend those. Ultimately, if you do go and test the helmet and do get concrete values on the threat generation, I'd like to see the data and we can compare it and see what we're getting. Otherwise, I can go and test it further. I think I need to make a second account to go to preview and yeah, it's actually against the terms of service to have both accounts logged in at the same time. So yeah, it's a bit of a fiddly one trying to figure out tank threat. Do you need somebody to be patient with you, or maybe breaking the toss? Otherwise, the boots, again, they could work, but only in the Temple of the Spider, and otherwise just not as good as what you're going to get from bonus 20% hit points. Special thank you again to these channel members, and goodbye for now.